I'm so excited to share with you a brand new gambit against the Caro-Kann defense. The Caro-Kann obviously has a very solid reputation and can be quite hard to prove an advantage against. But a really interesting move here is the move of bishop to f4. And you might be wondering, well, where is the gambit? Well, the gambit is that after d4, rather than taking back the pawn, we play the move of knight to c3. This is known as the Janicek gambit after the Polish FIDE master David Janicek, who you can see pictured just above here in the image. And the point is, after takes, when we take back, we now just get this big lead in development. We're just a few moves away from having all of our pieces developed. And if you check the lead chess database, White is already achieving a 65% win rate from this position at the 2500 plus level. And also at lower rating levels, it's actually scoring just as well. So this is a very dangerous weapon that Black has to defend very precisely just to survive, whereas we have very natural attacking ideas. So let's dive into it. There's going to be a bit of a longer video where I'll show you a few different ways it can play out. So even if you are a more advanced player, or even if you are playing someone who maybe doesn't go into the gambit, you're still going to know what to do against it. Sound good? If you are enjoying the video, do make sure to like and also subscribe for those who are new to the channel. But let's dive right in, starting with the move of knight to f3. There is another move order you can also play with queen to e2 is also a possible move order where you castle along faster, but I do think that knight f3 is objectively the better move here. So after knight f3, there was this game between Bauer against Keimer from the Europa-Czech Blitz of 2021 that I want to share. This was one of the very first games with this system, and I think that Keimer was taken by surprise. I mean, I'm a chess theoretician. I didn't even know about bishop f4 until just in the last 24 hours. So what are the odds the opponent are going to be ready for it, you know? Well, after bishop g4, the French GM Bauer played the move h3. Maybe Black's best bet might just be to take on f3 and just have a, solid kind of position. Something like this would allow Black to, for example, return the pawn here, but then Black will have quite reasonable play where to have somewhat neutralized the white initiative in this position. And I mean, that's the case of any opening. If Black plays all the best moves, they will equalize, but Keimer was surprised and did not play the best moves, and after knight bd7, after bishop h5, queen e2, knight bd7, White could have already played the move of g4, that would have been the best move order, but in the game after castles e6, White found the second chance to play g4, reach a position that I included in the thumbnail, and now after takes. Black just has a bit of a hard time defending their king against this big lead in development. In fact, it turns out you could probably even play a move of g5 and, even just sort of keep their king in the center, and that would make Black's life very difficult, actually, where White would have a clear advantage in a position like this, where we see the Black king is kind of stuck in the center here. But even if they do play something like long castles, their king still is going to have some problems where we will have ways to kind of bring our pieces into the attack gradually, and it's just very hard for Black to coordinate the pieces despite being a pawn ahead. Instead, White played knight e5, which is actually not that bad of a move either, though it does give Black some options like bishop b4 to try to disrupt our setup, but in the game, Keimer played bishop e7, and here's where I want to see if you can find the move that White should have played. Because in the game, White kind of lost his advantage, but what would be your move as White in this position? Let me know down in the comments below what move you would play. You can always pause if you need more time to think about it. But the answer here, there's actually kind of two answers. Like, you can also play, like, rook he1 and just develop with the idea that you're sort of threatening them to play this rook d7 tactic and kind of win two minor pieces for the rook, just using that pin against the black knights, as it were. So something like this would be winning for White, for example. But instead, there's also another move that also is maybe even more crushing, and that's the move of knight takes g6. And that's a very thematic way to kind of open up Black's king in this variation, that once we have most of our pieces developed, we should definitely be looking at these sort of sacrifice like knight g6 to keep their king in the center. For example, here we've got all the pieces lined up in the attack in the Paul Morphy style. Then the move knight e4 is another really great move here, saying that if they take, we're kind of able to bring the pieces again into the attack, but after... And also this pin means they can't even get their king to safety. That is completely paralyzed here. But after king f8, then we have knight g5, where we do pick back the material with the rook. But there's no need to take the rook immediately, because it's not going anywhere. So we can just play queen b3, set up a really monstrous check, and then a fork on c7, or even a move like bishop d6, just pinning him that way. If knight c5, we can just cash in with a nice little tactic in the move of queen f7, take, take, take. And now well done if you found the move rook takes c7, bishop d6, and then we're just a pawn up in the endgame, and we are basically winning. So that's how White could have won the game. In the end, they kind of lost the advantage, and the game ended in a draw, but the game was not so relevant for us from this point. So let's go back a little bit to position after knight f3, and also touch on a few alternatives. I do want to make sure that I do justice some of Black's better moves as well, just so you're kind of ready for the worst case scenario also in your games. The line that the engine recommends is basically to play g6 here. But after queen e2, it kind of suggests playing bishop g4 and sort of playing this move order of delaying bishop g7 so the bishop doesn't get stuck in on c8. It's a little bit computerish. I'm not really sure how likely you are to face this, but even if you do, you do still have moves like knight e4 that are still going to give you quite decent compensation with the bishop pair and the lead-in development. So even this worst case isn't all that bad, but if black does play bishop g7 instead, well, we castle long. Obviously, we're threatening to play a little discovered attack against the queen here. So knight bd7 was played, and you've got a few different attacking options, like you can play in the center and try to get back this pawn if you want to. But the approach I think most in the spirit of the opening is just to go h4 and just play h5 and rip open that black king. If they play a move like castles, we just go h5 anyway, and we can just sacrifice a whole lot of material. But in return, we do get a very strong attack against the black king here. And already it's very hard for black just to survive. But if they do defend better with a move like queen a5, well then we have some different options where we can go bishop c4 and try to hit this pawn, for example. And we can also play a move like h5 where we sacrifice a second pawn, but then in the arising position we do get quite a strong attack where we do have g4 and we are ready to open up the king side to our advantage, as it were. And black kind of has to defend like a computer just to survive at this point. So if they play a move such as e6, just trying to play very solidly, when I first saw this gambit, my first thought was, okay, just play e6, just develop solidly, and then you will be able to keep a fine game. But it's actually not quite that simple. Because let's say if you do play a move like bishop e7 as black, well, again, your white is threatening to play bishop h7 to regain the pawn, which is why black can't castle yet. And if they play a move like knight d7, we can play quite a few different ways, actually. Like knight g5, knight e4, h4, like all these moves kind of make sense, but I do sort of like this idea of playing a move such as knight g5 with the idea that after castles and h4, we sort of get this fishing pole style attack and we can just sort of pawn storm and just bring all of the pieces towards the black king in a very direct sort of way. Like for example, at h6, we just play g4 and we don't care if they take our knight, because that just helps open up the h file for a mating attack against the black king. So that's why in this position, black kind of needs to find this move of knight d5 at some point if they want to have a reasonable game. But we still get pretty standard compensation. Well, obviously, with them being able to double our pawns on the queen side, we're going to pivot a little bit and castle short instead. But still, the fact that their bishop is so passive and it's hard for them to get the queenside pieces out does mean in a position like this, we are going to have pretty good compensation for the material. In fact, if I don't play f5, it actually becomes pretty rough for black, because we can play moves like h4 and just set up a really strong attack against their king with knight g5 and stuff. Not to mention that d6 is also a bit of a vulnerable point for black in this structure. But yeah, that's the breakdown of knight f3, and if you are wondering why I don't recommend queen e2, I sort of mentioned already this bishop g4 move, but the reason is that if black now finds this move of bishop e6, which I will admit is not the most human move, like it's unlikely that someone, say, below 2200 will find such a move. But it does mean that black does get quite good counterplay with like queen a5, and they can sort of, get the bishop out with g6, bishop g7, and it just comes a bit hard to really get at the black king or, get through this bishop that covers their king very well on the e file. If they play bishop h5 instead, though, then you do kind of get what you want. And there was a little bit of a trap that Januzak got in the game against Quiroz Alva in a title Tuesday 2024. That game went e6, and now white found a pretty crushing move here in the move of g4, realizing that if bishop g6, we take the bishop. Also discovering attack on the queen, so we just win a full piece at this point. In the game, black gave up the bishop, but obviously didn't have anywhere near enough compensation, and white did go on to win from this point, as you would expect. So bit of an inspirational game, but I do want to touch on a few alternatives, such as the obvious question: well, what if they don't play the move of d takes e4 at this point? And what I'll do is I'll kind of like start with some of the less common moves, and then kind of like work our way down from there in a sense. So if they play moves such as e3, like this did happen in a game between Defremont against David Burkash, but the problem is that after FE3, white just gets a very strong center, and this pawn sack was a little bit nebulous, and the game ended in a draw. But it's pretty clear that white is just clearly better here. If they play Queen B2, you just take the center and just have a really nice advantage with very natural piece play, while black only has the queen and the knight currently in the game, which is just not enough here. If they play some other moves, I will mention there are a few moves that can be a little bit tricky and I think are actually better than the move of ED3. So it's kind of showing you the worst case scenario if you play this gambit. The move of knight d7 is quite a practical one, just returning the pawn to give some solid equality. For example, if d4, black just kind of gets a good Philidor where we sort of lost time moving our bishop, and we also lost a space advantage, which is not ideal. So I'd probably suggest playing knight e4 instead as white, but I do have to admit this position is also pretty comfortable for black, and black does have the better side of equality with their extra space in a in a position like this one, let's say. But yeah, that's kind of the worst case scenario for white, and knight d7 is also not really the first move I think most people will think of, so it can be quite a good practical weapon in that sense. Also, to move queen b6, another move that's actually quite tricky, and this might actually be the very best move in this position because if you play a move like rook b1, it's not really in the spirit of the position, because now even if they just play ed3, we kind of lost the option to castle long like we saw beforehand. So queen d6 is a very tricky move order, and I'd probably recommend playing the move queen d2 in response, saying that if they do play something like queen b2, that we are able to get our pawn back and have pretty good compensation with our space and our lead in development. If they play something like e takes d3, again, we're just very happy to see them just get greedy and take all the pawns, because in a position like this, you already have a few nasty tricks like the move of knight b5, for example, where either you get your knight in with the attack, or, if they take, they just get mated like this. That's a nice little trap that can catch somebody out. The best move for black, again, is not very intuitive. Actually, the move e5 is a move that black needs to find here to have a good game. Returning the pawn, but at least getting a little bit of an initiative against the bishop. And there was actually a game from this position played between Boya against Namibia, where white ended up playing bishop g3 and sort of playing it in this kind of way. But I think that it would have been more precise to get this position with the bishop on f4 rather than g3. I mean, white can still play this way. I just think that a position like this one, for example, which is not what happened in the game, but I think a position like this would be quite pleasant for black, just because the pin is kind of annoying, and white structure it does have one more pawn island compared to black's here. But yeah, I would probably suggest bishop f4 as maybe being a slightly more precise approach to the position. Because after bishop b4, for instance, you kind of have some interesting ideas. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe knight e2 is also possible, but after rook b3, queen a5, you do have a few interesting options where, for example, queen d4 is one move where you just sort of provoke a move like bishop f8 that leaves them, quite behind in development, and, maybe black is still a tiny bit better in this endgame, but it's still a, unbalanced structure where all three results are possible. I'd say that the really fun line, though, is the one where you play the move rook takes b4 and, sacrifice the exchange, but just make it kind of hard for black to really develop their pieces. I mean, it's true that objectively black does have quite a nice advantage, but it's something that in blitz could be a bit of a annoying thing for black to deal with the pin and their lack of development. So you kind of have a choice which way to play it, but yeah, queen b6 is kind of the worst case scenario, and that would sort of be my tip for black players in terms of how to deal with this brand new gambit against the Caro-Kann. With that being said, for the rest of the video, I'm going to focus a little bit more on, some of the other continuations black can play. Moves that maybe are a bit more common in practice compared to these computer moves we just saw. So you know how to deal with it and get a good position as white. Now, knight f6 is a move I actually be fairly happy to see, because now after d4, the difference between playing it this way versus, this version where we would, lose the right to castle, Well, clearly in this instance, if black now plays queen takes d1, well, we just take back with the rook and we just have a very nice lead in development. We basically have an improved version of a line that I used to play actually quite a lot about 5 years ago. It was one of my favorites against the Caro-Kann, this endgame variation with knight f3, where you sort of play this structure and with bishop f4, you can kind of get a similar sort of position, just with a lot less theory attached to it. But it's still a similar idea of making it hard for him to play the e5 break is a parallel we can notice between the two lines as such. Now going back to the position after knight f6 d4. So there was a nice game between Janicek against Brainic in Tile Tuesday 2024, where after the move of e6, White just played a nice little prophylaxis of a3, just avoiding any annoying pin on the knight. And after knight d7, knight f3, knight c5. Knight c5 is probably a little bit of a mistake. Like, Black should probably play bishop e7 and play a little bit more solidly, but White definitely does still have an advantage at this point due to our extra space and some of the passive black pieces. But in the game after knight c5, White just had a very pleasant advantage. In fact, even the move knight c4 was a little bit of an opportunity that White could have gone for, realizing that the threat of the fork with knight b6 is much stronger than Black's threat to take on e4. And that's a very good technique as well. I cover in my chess lessons this concept of making a equal or stronger threat in response to the opponent's threat. I mean, in the game, yeah, Black sort of managed to get some counterplay, and the rest of the game was maybe not so relevant in comparison. I mean, these are mostly blitz games that we are looking at, so very fresh theory. Like, this is very virgin territory where if your opponent, say, is using like Mega Database instead of some online databases, then it's very unlikely they'll ever really look at Bishop f4. Now, I do have to point out that Black probably should play the move of Queen a5. That's a move that I would sort of give us again a little bit of a tip where there was a Janicek game where he kind of let his opponent, Yakonowitz, get in the move e5 and just get this very, very pleasant position where, again, like, Black's just got very active piece play and White's a little bit stuck here. So to avoid this, I'd recommend the move of Queen d4, just not letting them get into e5 break so easily. And after something like knight fd7, knight f3, e6, Black is objectively not doing so badly here in all fairness. Like, if they find this move of Queen b6, then yeah, they do equalize in the arising endgame. But there are other ways you can play it. Like, you can also play the move e5 and play again a little bit more in the gambit kind of spirit with e6, where you sacrifice a pawn, but you do make it hard for Black to get their pieces and especially their bishops developed. So it's an interesting way of playing it that can be really optimized for blitz chess in that respect. But yeah, that's the way to kind of approach it. And as it was, that kind of covers all the different options, at least all the kind of serious options after the move of knight c3. I mean, to be fair, there are other moves like e5 or queen a5 that the engine thinks are decent, but they're not. They're very unlikely going to face these moves in an actual game, so I've decided not to cover it. Just the video won't be like too long in a sense, but it is worth pointing out that, yeah, that this is not the only way to play it. Like, you're not limited to playing it as a gambit. Like, let's say if you're an advanced chess player whose games are in the database and your opponents are, maybe going to prepare for you a little bit before the game. If you're in that situation, then you can also play this with the move of d takes c4. It's kind of a bit of an alternative build to sort of throw the opponent off. Like, if you want to get in a dynamic position, you can play it with knight c3, and if you want to get a more strategic position, you can play it with d takes c4. Because after takes, like, Black does still have to find some precise moves here in order to maintain the balance. So, in this position, the way they probably should play is the move of f6, with the idea of going e5 and kicking our bishop. And probably what I'd recommend, like, there was a game between Shimanov, a very creative Russian grandmaster now representing USA, against David Castor. Kind of funny seeing that name because he's an Australian chess player, but in that game, it went like knight d2, and Shimanov just kind of did a decent job of just sort of outplaying his opponent from a normal position. Like, he trade off the bishops in the right way, and when Black sort of missed his chance to liquidate everything and kind of equalize it, it just meant that White was able to just steadily build up a kind of nice advantage. Like, objectively, it's not really that much for at this stage. Like, position is still very equal. Well, maybe actually White might have misplayed it a little bit, so we can sort of see that with this, it's not enough just to know a system. Like, we do need to be a little precise with the move order if we do want to set some questions for Black. So I would suggest the move of a4 instead. just with this idea of just grabbing that space on the queen side, and also if they play bishop e6, we can still go for knight c4 like in the Shimanov game as such. It can potentially transpose the fact. But yeah, instead, if they go knight d7, we kind of just play like we have different options. Like the move knight d2 is the one I originally had covered, but I think that a5 and playing for the dark squares would be a little bit annoying. And so I'm going to suggest playing the move of a5 instead, just a way to curtail that. And if bishop c5 again, just keep the tension between the bishops. They're probably going to exchange at some point. I mean, the position objectively is probably about equal, but it is a position with no theory, where we can sort of build up our position in a harmonious way. And I can either go to e2 or f2. You can also expand on the queen side. So it's a position where we're kind of playing for two results. Like, yeah, objectively black should be okay, but white's the only one who can really play for a win around this point. And I definitely have had a lot of success playing these sort of positions in different versions, both with the knight f3 version I showed you before, and also with the black piece I used to play this system called the rat, where even though you end up with like the king being stuck here, you sort of get this very harmonious position where you just go for a setup like this and just kind of, make it really hard for white to kind of find a good plan. Where like a position like this just ends up already being slightly better for black. Because you have more space and you're just kind of place your pawns just to completely dominate their knights. So the reason I showed this is just to demonstrate we're kind of going for a very similar theme when we play a position like this, just to play against the black knights, essentially. Now, if they play moves such as h6, which happened in a game between Makarian against Popov, Tard Tuesday 2024, I mean, black's idea is to go g5, but there's a little bit of a weird move. Again, a4 might be the best move here, just to kind of secure c4 for our knight, but in the game, f3 was played, and yeah, this is also quite reasonable, like why not playing in a little bit of a creative fashion with bishop c3, which I'm really not a big fan of. I think that this sort of position would give black quite reasonable play on the dark squares in this instance. But I think instead of that, you can just play more simply, just something like bishop e3, and if they go bishop g7, we kind of just kill their bishop and just sort of play the normal kind of moves like we've been seeing before, just like a4, just playing on the queen side, using our space advantage to our benefit. I mean, black probably should play f5, but then we do still have moves like bishop d4 to still have a small advantage in a position like this one, for example, like bishop c4 to keep their king in the center, or a move like h4 just to weaken their king side is also possible. Yeah, there's a few ways you can play it. Maybe I'd lean bishop c4 if pressed. So yeah, that kind of covers the different ideas with this endgame variation, the endgame way of playing the Janusak variation. And to kind of conclude this video, what I'll do is I'll just share with you a few different approaches, just what to do if they don't play the move of d4. And, because this is not such a theoretical position, it does mean that there are quite a few different ways that black can play it. So I might not cover every single legal move, but at least cover all the serious moves. And also what I'll do is I'll kind of go from like mainline sort of more to sideline as the approach I'll kind of take. But basically the move knight f6 is one usually fairly happy to see in general, because then you just kind of kick their knight away. And, compared to a French defense, they kind of need an extra tempo to get in c5, which is not really ideal. Meaning that in a position like this, you're just going to be slightly better. You can play on the queen side. You can also just develop the pieces quite naturally. And, white, I think, is just going to be fairly comfortable in a position like this one. Like, you basically have an improved French defense because of the lost time with their knight, compared to, say, the advanced version where knight is more on g8 and can kind of come around this way, for instance. And if they play e6 again, it's kind of like a modified French where, I do think that, the fact that c6 is probably a less useful move than bishop f4 does make me quietly optimistic about white's chances here. White in the game here between Rue against Byron. Like this was a over the board game where white just kind of took the center and just sort of transitioned back to a more normal position. Later on, he kind of played a little bit dynamically, where he sort of played this c4 that, probably objectively is not the best move, but black kind of didn't really know how to deal with it in the game, and I was kind of able to get a pretty strong attack for the pawn, just using black's lack of development kind of against them. That being said, I think in this position, I would probably rather play a move like h4. I feel like that's more in the attacking style to use the pawn as a pawn, just taking away that knight g6 move by having this hook to attack it. and then maybe later playing a move like c4 and sort of opening up the center in our favor. But I do think this will give white a, especially if they play c5. But I do think this will give white a very strong initiative because you just have so many different options at this point to really prosecute your advantage, while all of the black minor pieces do feel very passive in this position. So that would be my tip for white. One move that is kind of an interesting one from black's point of view is the move of knight d7. But I think knight d7 is a little bit inaccurate here, and it's for a reason maybe a bit different to what you'd expect. Because I had kind of assumed that the move of knight f3 would just be the natural reply, just avoiding e5. But then they do have moves like queen b6, which can be a tiny bit annoying for us. So what I suggest instead is playing the move of e takes d5, and then basically transitioning into an improved version of an exchange Caro-Kann. And it might seem a bit weird because you might think, well, isn't the knight just better on d7 than on b8? But actually, no, because the knight on c6 does exert pressure on the pawn, whereas on d7 it does shut in the bishop, which by extension means the rook on a8 is also shut in. And there was this game that was played between Martin Barcelo against Wietic, where I just kind of played the normal developing moves. There was c3. I guess the idea of c3 is I want to meet queen b6 with queen b3, and in the London kind of style, just say that this sort of structure is an improvement for white, opening the file for the rook, giving you a bit of a pawn break on this side of the board as well. But black goes g3. We have some fairly natural developments. White put the bishop on d3. I'd opine that it might be more precise to play bishop e2 instead, just so that your pawn's not kind of hitting your bishop's not hitting a brick wall in this g6 pawn that's defended twice. You could also start with h3 and then play bishop e2 if you are worried about any knight h5 funny business. Clearly this is not going to be so effective anymore, but in the game, yeah, we had bishop d3, and the game was sort of a bit back and forth. Like after knight e4, black was trying to get this kind of weird sort of stonewall, but it's just not very effective here. And in the game, black's attempts to attack just weren't really very successful. The game sort of loses a little bit of its relevance from here, but basically the move of bishop e4 would have been very strong, with the idea that they can only take one of the bishops at a time. If f e4, we can go bishop g5, and then in this a rising position with bishop f6. So black's idea is basically to be able to say that they can take the pawn on f2 and kind of have a good position after this. But instead, we actually have a bit of a computerish move of knight e4, where we can actually just sort of sacrifice the bishop or sacrifice the knight. Because if they take our bishop, we just take, and they can't really take back because of rook g4 winning the queen. Meaning in this case, you already have free pawns for the piece, and their king is also very exposed, meaning that white will have a pretty nice advantage. And obviously, if they take the other way, then yeah, this structure is an absolute, depression for black. You can't really get away with this. So yeah, that's kind of breaking down how to deal with knight to d7. Actually, I clicked the wrong thing, but we are back now. Now, what if they play a move like queen b6, which is actually the top line of the engine at a very high depth here? So definitely a move we should pay some attention to. I think the way that white should have played is actually not to try to defend the pawn, because if you try to defend the pawn, you do end up losing the initiative a little bit in a situation like this one, for instance. So to avoid this, I would recommend just sacrificing the pawn. Again, playing it a bit more of a gambit with the move of knight to d2. And then after queen takes b2, knight f3, we do have a lead in development, and we do have the center to compensate for the pawn. We will have moves like rook b1 to increase our lead in development even at the price of a second pawn. There was this interesting game between Kolovic against Gourlay in the British Team Championship of 2023 of England. So after knight d7, Kolovic played the move of d4. There's a few ways you could play it. Like you could also start with bishop e2, and you could also play it like this, to just developing more quietly and keeping your options open. The computer points out if you do find this move bishop h6 and sort of tuck the queen away on g7 that you are going to be fine, but, very unlikely a human would play this way, in my opinion. The move of d4 was how Kolovic played it, just with the idea that if they do play g6, well, now you have some options where you can play like rook a1, for instance, rook b1. You also can play bishop d3 and, just develop and just play normally as if you didn't sacrifice a pawn. But rook b1's kind of the move that appeals to me the most, I think, that if they take... at this point, the move of knight to b3 is kind of an interesting one, where you sort of play to just sort of take squares away from the queen and just try to trap that queen in. And after something like knight f6, you kind of have, in the worst case, an option just to kind of repeat moves and and just sort of make a draw, because if they try to, try to avoid the draw, they end up either getting their queen trapped with bishop a5, which is pretty cool for us, or they end up like losing a piece to e5 and this knight g5 move to break the pin on the king, so that we can then take the pin on the pawn to the king, so that we can take the knight on f6. But yeah, that's sort of the worst case scenario. There are ways to also play it on, like you have moves like e5 as well, where you just kind of play again for that long-term compensation. You are threatening rook a1 to trap their queen, so then we can just kind of develop, and yeah, we have the space, we have a big lead in development. Their queen is also a bit offside, so it's definitely a position where white has pretty good practical chances, and black has to continue playing precisely to have even a reasonable game. But yeah, in this game, Gole decided to play e5 to sacrifice the pawn back, which I don't think is all that effective. I think the way the game played out, white just ended up getting a really strong initiative. Very nice use of the intermezzos by Kolovic, by the way. After knight e5, white had got the pawn back, but they still had their initiative. Because if black does try to take the pawn, what's going to happen is that black is just going to be so far behind development. We can take the pawn back anyway. If they try to defend it this way, then we can take their pawn on b7, so it's just really, really bad for black. And in the game, like I said, it did end in a draw, but at this point, white does have a pretty clear advantage. And so, yeah, basically, white should have probably won it with best play, but in the end, black kind of slivered out. But that is maybe not so relevant to this particular video, let's say. Finally, to kind of conclude this coverage, if they play a move like f6, I mean, it's not that likely you'll face it, in my opinion, but it's kind of a fun idea that you can play d4 and actually sacrifice the pawn and have a much improved version of Black Mardima Gambit, because of just how weakening this f6 move is. And if f5, we can just kind of play f3, and if they take, we just have a turbocharged Black Mardima Gambit where they just weaken their position so severely. If they play d4, I'd probably just play e5 and just kind of have an improved version of a King's Indian attack, where we just are very well placed to support the pawn on e5. And finally, if they do play a move like g6, this is the final move I'm going to touch on here. Again, g6 is actually a pretty decent move, and if black plays it correctly, they probably do equalize. But they have to find some slightly inhuman moves in order to achieve that. For example, there's kind of two ways you can play it. I'll kind of touch on both of them. So the first way is just to play knight f3 and just kind of develop the pieces very quietly. This is what happened in a couple of games actually. Like there was even a Gotham chess game actually where Levi Osman was playing with the black pieces, and he played this move of bishop g4 against Ivan Yeletsky in a Tiled Tuesday 2021. And yeah, in that game after knight d2, sorry, actually it wasn't this one. It was the move bishop e2 that Yeletsky played, and once black missed a chance to sort of take on e4 and try to get this endgame a bit like we sort of seen before. Once that opportunity was missed, white kind of had a good chance now to play a move e5 and just kind of get an improved version of a French. Like even a bit later on, white could have played this e5 move. Like once white didn't play it, the game loses a bit of its relevance. But yeah, basically white would have the bishop pair, they'd have the space, and you could even, go for an attack on the black king with moves like h4, h5 in the middle game, for example. So just a very stable advantage for white here. Now what black probably should do instead is they probably should play d takes e4. It is true they also could have played on the previous move, but that might be a little bit inconsistent with, playing the move g6 on move 3, let's say. And after takes, I mean, I think a position like this probably is just going to be okay for black. I still think it is probably a bit easier for white to play it up to, say, king 8, c2. If they do play a move like knight f6, you can play like knight fd2, and, if knight c5, that is, you sort of play against their knights and just leave their knights without any really good squares. And if they play bishop h6, you can sort of trade and say that, it's an equal position, but it's a bit easier to play for white. Again, because they have a bit more space and some of their pieces are a little bit struggling to find a good placement. So that's one way to play it, knight f3. And the other way kind of fits with what we saw before, knight d7, where you can take and then play the move d4, and you're basically saying that you are, maybe a tempo down compared to the exchange Caro-Kann. But you're also saying that this g6 bishop g7 isn't really one of the best options for black in the Caro-Kann, and that it's kind of worth the extra tempo to basically take away their option of going for the standard bishop g4, e6, bishop d6 that Caro-Kann players kind of like to do. Now, objectively speaking, probably position's not that bad for black here either, that they're probably still doing okay. But it's a bit of a different kind of position to what they maybe were hoping to get. There was a game between Janasak against Rob Molina, Molina outrunning Janasak by a bit, but it didn't stop White from kind of outplaying his opponent, like after h3. If black takes, White just has this very harmonious position, like bishop d3 or bishop e2 castles, rook e1, and you're just going to kind of use the e5 square as a bit of a strong point for your play in the middle game. And after bishop f5, White just did a good job at just kind of hitting this pawn. Again, black is sort of suffering a little bit from their bishop being on g7 rather than e7, and White was a bit better at this point, and White did in fact go on to win the game from this position after a long battle, which is maybe a little bit outside the topic of this video. Because like if I showed you like every move every game, this video would be like 1.5 hours long. And if they do play queen b6, I would probably just play the move of queen b3. There was a Janicek game where he played knight a3 that ultimately ended in a draw, which is a kind of interesting alternative, but the thing is that you're probably then going to be playing queen b3 anyway, and then your knight's a little bit offside on a3. So that's why I think it's just better to play queen b3 directly, and, if they let you double up their pawns and you just get a very nice structure, I think white is really just doing very well in a position like this. Like, we have all the breaks, and black is really very short on counterplay. So, yeah, and also if you are wondering how black should play, actually the top line of the engine is actually to play this intermezzo of bishop g7. Again, it hasn't really been played before. I'm not so sure your opponents are likely to find it. But the idea is basically to meet d4 with queen b6 and kind of get this attack going in this way for good play. So that's another little tip where you can play this way as black if you want a bit of a creative answer to the Janicek attack. Because, I mean, if white has to play c3, then yeah, black can even sort of make a gambit of it and, have sort of very good compensation himself, almost, in fact, in the style of our white gambit in a way. But again, very unlikely for someone to play this way if they haven't, studied the theory beforehand, which, like I said, I'm a chess theoretician and I only discovered this bishop f4 move in the last 24 hours or so. So it's very unlikely your opponent will find it. And we've also seen it leads to positions very different to usual Caro-Kann, because normally in the Caro-Kann, they get their bishop out to f5 or g4. Like, that's kind of the idea of playing the Caro-Kann rather than the French, to keep that bishop's long diagonal open, and to be able to develop bishop actively before playing e6. But with this gambit, we kind of don't let them do that, and we force black onto our territory. At least I know for me, this is a gambit I'm really excited to start playing in my own games online. So, best of luck playing it. Do let me know down in the comments below what would be one of the things that you got, like what was a move or an idea that you really liked from this video. Do let me know that down below, and yeah, I will see you in the next one, and yes, also see you in the next suggested video. Take care.